Hey friends, it's Corey from Hey Let's Make Stuff, and in today's video I'm going to be showing you my method for wrapping a tumbler for sublimation. Now if you've ever wrapped your own tumbler and you've ended up with a white seam down the back or ghosting at the top and bottom, it is definitely due to your wrapping. And I've done enough of these now that I think I have a pretty good method, and so I'd like to share that with you today. Let's look at what you're going to need. First, you're going to obviously need a tumbler. You can go ahead and take the lid and the straw out. You don't want to press with these on top of the tumbler. Then you're going to need some rubbing alcohol and a couple cotton swabs. I prefer this to a lint roller, although sometimes I will do this and then I will lint roll it just to make sure there's no dust or debris or fingerprints or anything else on your tumbler. Those can all mess with your sublimation transfer. You're also going to need your sublimation image. I went ahead and printed this off on my sublimation printer. I wanted to use an image that had sort of a dark bottom and top so that you can really see that this method helps decrease the amount of ghosting that you're going to see on the top and bottom of your tumbler. For cutting your transfer, I highly recommend a self-healing cutting mat, an acrylic ruler, and a rotary blade. I would prefer this over a paper trimmer because I have found that I can get a much finer, very tiny cut off the edge, so I can really size that transfer to be the exact size of my tumbler. You're also going to need some tape. I like the blue tape instead of the yellow tape. I find that it doesn't leave any residue or anything like that on my tumbler. This is from PYD Life. I really like it. I also have a pair of scissors handy, as well as a couple sheets of butcher paper. You'll wrap the butcher paper around your tumbler after we put the image on so that it doesn't leave marks in your press. And then finally, you're going to need a press. I actually did a review on this PYD Life tumbler press. I really like it. I'll go ahead and link to it. But yeah, you're going to need some way to press your tumbler. Let's start cutting our image. So I like using this cutting mat and this ruler, and let me give you a little secret about this back of this ruler. I have actually added these little sandpaper circles, and I'll link to them, and it makes your ruler much more sticky so it's not sliding around when you're cutting your image. It's really great. So I start by cutting off the bottom edge of the transfer. Now you don't want to cut off any ink because these are basically the same size as you can print with your printer, right? So we get right there at the edge. We don't want any white edge. And then you hold it down and you can cut it this way using your rotary tool. You want to make sure, obviously, to keep your fingers away. This is very sharp and there have been really bad accidents with these things, so make sure that you keep your fingers out of the way. Okay, so you can see here I have a nice clean edge for my tumbler, and then I'm going to cut the top edge just exactly the same. Trim that there. So now I have my image with both the top and the bottom cut out. Once you cut off the top and the bottom, you can wrap your decal around your tumbler to see if you need to trim any more. I always print my transfer just slightly larger, maybe 3% larger, so that I have that little bit of wiggle room. It's small enough that it doesn't become pixelated, but it's large enough that it gives me just that extra bit of wiggle room if I need to trim. I'd rather trim down, right? You can't put more back on. So you can see here that I have like a little bit extra here at the top. So I'm gonna go ahead and trim off just a little bit more. And this is why I really like the acrylic ruler and the rotary cutter. You can really just cut off the smallest amounts without it being a problem. I find that my paper trimmer tends to sometimes jam at the corners if I'm trying to cut a very thin slice. So I'll trim off a little bit more here. I'll test it again. Okay, so that looks really good to me. There's just a hair of an overlap. That means we're not going to have a white edge on the top or the bottom, so that's great. Now we have to trim to wrap it around. So I'm going to trim off one side here, using my acrylic ruler, the same way I did it on the other side. There we go. Now you can wrap this around to see how much you're going to want to trim off the other side. So I'll wrap it around using the image out, but that way I can kind of see where this overlaps. I've got, I don't know, maybe 1/4 inch here, so I'm going to trim off a little bit more than just the white here. The goal is to have your image basically butt up against itself here. You definitely don't want a white stripe down the back of your tumbler, especially when you're using a big dark image like this one. And if you overlap, you may get the possibility of both layers of ink sublimating. So you'll get the overlap of sublimation, which will create just a slightly darker line. Now the darker line is much, much preferable, I think, to having a big white line down the back of your tumbler. But if you can, we're gonna try and get those to just butt up right against each other so that you have no seam at all. So I've trimmed off this other side here. Let's see how good this looks wrapped around. Do this here. And you can see here that I'm still overlapping just the tiniest bit. So I'm gonna go ahead and trim just a little bit more off. Let's see here. I would rather, again, have to trim several times than not have enough to go all the way around. So let's trim this off. And you can see here how much I'm trimming off. It is just this, the slightest amount. All right, so let's wrap this around again and see how that does for us. There we go, that's pretty close. So if I have this ever so slight overlap, I think it's barely overlapping at all. So I think that'll work really well. And you'll notice that most sublimation designs don't actually meet up in the back well, right? Like you're gonna know where the seam is on this. It's just because tumblers are all different sizes and it's very hard to get an actual seamless wrap. So this is totally normal that these two things don't line up properly. You just don't want a big ugly white strip down the back of your tumbler. So let's go ahead and clean the tumbler before we put the transfer on. So I have a little bit of alcohol here. I'm just cleaning all the way around the edge here. And then you want to make sure this fully dries before you put your transfer on. So I'm going to give this just a minute to dry and I'll be right back. Okay, my tumbler is dry. I've moved all my cutting stuff over here to the side. Now let's wrap our image around the tumbler. So to do this, I like to put it flat on the table and then I can use the table to make sure that it's straight, just like this. And then you're going to hold it as tight as you can and put a piece of tape there in the center. Just like this, really pulling it tight. There we go. Then you're gonna put tape all the way up the top and then all the way down the bottom here, again, pulling as tight as you can. Again, if you see that you're gonna have a white stripe, print it out again. I think spending the 16 cents or whatever it costs to print out a transfer is so much better than wasting a blank because you have this big white stripe down the side. So I'm using my automatic tape dispenser here, which cuts pieces the correct size. I have an ever so slight overlap. All right, so right now I have all of the tape down the side here, and we're gonna cover up more of this later, but I wanted to leave that there for now. So the next thing we want to do is tape the top and the bottom. And this is where things get really tricky because this is where a lot of that ghosting or those little white crinkly edges show up. So this is my method for doing it. I cut a very long piece of tape here. And I start on the side opposite from the seam, like this. And then I work my way toward that seam. I'm not going to pull it over yet. I'm actually going to just hold it like this. So there's still a little extra tape here. And then I'm going to do the same on the other side. Too much tape here. Trim a little bit. All right. So this means that you've been pushing all of that extra space toward the seam. So once you get there, you can then overlap that and do this. So now you have a really tight seam up here at the top. Now you want to tuck all of this tape in. And again, I do this starting in the back and I just do every little bit here over and over, all the way around. Using my fingers to really try and work that edge tight. Let's see. And sometimes you can even tell, you're like, oh, that little bit's going to be a problem. So you want to make sure you work on that pretty good. Okay, so we've pushed all that tape in, and now we're going to do the bottom, and then I'm going to show you my little trick. So for the bottom, you're going to do the exact same thing. Pull your piece of tape here. Start in the back, away from the seam, like this. And kind of pull it all toward the front. There we go. And then the same thing on this side. Okay, so so now we have this all the way around, and again, I'm just gonna go ahead and press all of this in. I find that the bottom is where the biggest issues happen. So just press all of this in, use that elbow grease so that you can get as much, you want the transfer as flat as possible against your image. So a lot of people would have you stop here, but I've got one little trick that I like to do, which is to roll the bottom and the top edges of the cup on my table. And I actually like using this cutting mat. So I basically just do this. I mean, and I do this a lot because you want like all the angles. You want to basically press that paper and transfer into your tumbler. So do this on the top and the bottom. See how this looks. And then you can even see, like, oh, how's this looking? This looks pretty good to me. It might be a little bit over here. So again, just press, press, press. You're basically pressing that transfer as tight as possible onto your tumbler. Use that elbow grease again, just like that. Now I know it's very hard to see on camera, but where the taper is on this mug, the paper really is just hugging it really well. So I'm hoping that this will produce a really crisp transfer down here at the bottom. Just gonna keep doing it a few more times. Okay, so now we're gonna do the same with the top. I'm not quite as worried about the top because the taper is not quite as tapery. So let's see, but I'm still gonna do it. I'll make sure we really get that pressed in there. You can take a look and see if it looks like there's going to be any spots like over here. It looks like we could do it again. Do know that if you are doing this method and you're doing it on a wood table like this, it will leave indents into your table. I have like a bunch of marks all over my table here from doing this. But it's a craft table, so I don't really mind. Okay, so that looks really good to me. Now the last thing we're going to do here is we're going to put a long piece of tape just straight down this center seam here. Okay, so we have our tumbler all done here. You can see that we have the horizontal tape marks, the big vertical piece, as well as the top and bottom. Now, before we put it in the heat press, you want to make sure you tape a few pieces of butcher paper. Now, normally I just use one piece of butcher paper, but the ink on this was very heavy and I don't want it leaching through this and one piece of butcher paper, so I'm going to do two. One, two. Okay, so when I'm pressing this, I actually want to put the seam at the top. So the seam of my actual transfer. So you can kind of, I never put this very tight, so you can kind of slip it out here and see. I've got the seam here at the top. That means when the press closes around it, again, it's going to push toward that seam. And then if that means if there's any white space or anything like that, it's going to press those two ends of the transfer together. All right, so we're going to put it in the press here, with that tape side up, and close it here. So this is going to count down 120 seconds, and when it's done, I'm going to grab my heat-resistant gloves, and then I'm going to flip it 180 degrees so that the seam is on the bottom. That way we will get the full transfer all the way around. Okay, so this has been cooling for a while. It's completely cool to the touch. I went ahead and removed all of the paper and the transfer and everything. I just didn't feel like you needed to watch me do that. But this is our finished tumbler, and I think it looks really, really good. This top edge is perfect all the way around. It's dark, it looks really, really great. The seam itself looks fantastic. Like I said, the image doesn't match up. It just wasn't designed to match up, but there's no white stripe and it doesn't look like there's anything wrong with this. This seam looks fantastic. The bottom edge is like 90% good, which is pretty darn good because it really is hard to get that tapered edge, especially using such a dark transfer. So you can see here, there's just a little bit of ghosting, and then over here, if I tilt it up a little bit, there's just a little bit of ghosting right here. But if you set it on the table, you can't see any of that. It's all below kind of where that curve starts. So overall, I'm really happy with how this tumbler turned out. I would love to know if this tumbler wrapping method works for you. So give it a shot and let me know in the comments. If you have questions, please ask them below as well. If you liked this video and found it helpful, I'd appreciate a like, subscribe to this channel for more weekly content, and I'll see you next week.